Prince Adam of Eternia became the most powerful man in the universe when he was given the Sword of Power. But not every version of He-Man across the Masters of the Universe franchise has a fixed level of power. The character has played many different versions of himself in the decades that has been in film and television. But did you know that there are some extremely twisted, diabolical versions of He-Man as well? It sounds weird, right? He-Man, almost by virtue, stands for strength and honor, and an unshakable sense of rightness. What if I were to tell you that there are some iterations where the character goes against everything he's known for? Instead of being the beacon of hope for Eternia, where He-Man becomes a symbol of something dark and dangerous. Think about an Injustice Superman parallel for He-Man. That's what I'm talking about. Now that I have your attention, let's dive into these evil alter egos of Prince Adam, and you let me know which one sounds like the most twisted. Faker. This is Skeletor's answer to He-Man in the form of an evil version of the hero, and is one of the oldest and most consistent evil He-Man concepts in the entire franchise. Faker is presented differently in different interpretations, but the original toy line showed him as a blue-skinned robot replica of He-Man, faithful to Skeletor. The blue skin was really the only distinguishable feature, because other than that, Faker looked exactly like He-Man. The toy was packaged as Evil Robot Imposter, or Evil Robot of Skeletor. I was a kid when this line had dropped, and I remember the craze people had to get their hands on this bizarre and blue evil He-Man. This figure was reissued in 1987 with a slightly different color scheme and a solid head, and to date, this one remains a very sought-after item for collectors. While this is how he's generally viewed by the fans, some other media show him as a magical creation instead of an outright robot, and his main objective is to fool the people of Eternia by posing as the exact duplicate of their hero. The mini-comics followed the robot origin story, where Faker was employed by Skeletor to impersonate He-Man, so that King Randor would not be able to uncover the secret of Keldor. However, Randor was able to see through the deception and defeat the dupe by impaling him with his spear. The Filmation storyline made Faker into a magical being who looked exactly like He-Man, and he was not blue either. However, to differentiate him from the real guy, they gave him glowing eyes and a very hollow voice. From a distance and under low lighting, he could even fool He-Man's closest friends into believing that he was the real deal. Faker was used as bait by Skeletor to lure the sorceress out of Castle Grayskull when he pretended to impersonate He-Man suffering an injury. This allowed Evil Lyn to turn her into a tree using the shaping staff. However, the real champion of Eternia quickly got involved and telepathically encouraged the sorceress to keep fighting, so she was finally able to nullify the effects of the spell. She then released Prince Adam from the staff's power as well, since he was turned into gold. Finally, he came face to face with the imposter, but it was quickly established that the latter was just as physically capable as he was. Faker was able to toss He-Man aside and smash huge boulders to pieces, and he even tricked He-Man into falling down a cliff. Fortunately, he held onto the edge and grabbed Faker's leg to hoist himself up to safety. During this struggle, Faker fell into the bottomless gorge instead. Earlier, Skeletor had remarked that he could bring Faker back using the staff, but since it had been destroyed, Faker was never seen again. Writer Paul Dini intended to bring the character back and change his skin color, turning him into a Bizarro-like enemy. But ultimately, this didn't happen. Faker in the London edition's UK magazine was mostly similar to the Filmation version, except that he retained his blue skin color, which he could change into the regular skin tone of He-Man for a short period of time. After suffering a humiliating defeat at the hands of He-Man, he was thirsty for revenge. The UK annual version of Faker is also a very interesting one, because there, he's portrayed as a violent mass murderer who had escaped from the intergalactic prison star. He was also a very trusted aide of Skeletor, who had cast a spell on him to turn him into a replica of He-Man. However, due to some mistake on the part of Beastman, Faker ended up with blue skin instead, and hence could never fool the Eternians in a way that he was supposed to. His origin story is different in the MOTU classics, as he was built by Man-at-Arms to be a stand-in for Prince Adam whenever he would be out doing his He-Man stuff. However, he was abandoned and recovered by the Triclops from the Royal Junkyard. Skeletor then jumped at the opportunity of reprogramming Faker to replace He-Man and convince the Eternians that their hero has betrayed King Randor and turned to the dark side. Revelation portrayed the most accurate replica of He-Man in Faker. He was pretty much indistinguishable from the original. Skeletor had used the shaping staff to create the duplicate, and also to disguise himself and Evil-Lyn to gain access to Castle Grayskull. Faker approached the castle with Clawful, disguised Evil-Lyn, and Spikor, Skeletor, as prisoners. But the facade quickly fell apart when Spikor addressed the sorceress, which made her suspicious. His walking stick was later revealed to be the staff, so his jig was up. The sorceress fired a bolt of magic at him, sending both him and the staff flying. She was then grabbed by Faker before she could fire again, and ultimately, his true form was revealed when she managed to escape his grip. This blasted off both his arms, but he was able to reattach them to launch a final attack. At the last moment, Man-at-Arms shot a laser beam at him, slicing him neatly in two. Savage He-Man. While Faker was made to fool people into thinking he is He-Man, Savage He-Man is not necessarily something that needs to be created. The simplest way to explain this alter ego is to imagine what the power of Grayskull would be like without any moral guiding force behind it. Imagine a kind of power that is absolute and all-consuming, but mindless at the same time. There is no inherent goodness to it, and no inherent evil either, for that matter. But because it's so malleable, this kind of power is more likely to do harm than good. This concept of Savage He-Man can be traced back to the early toy variants of Wundar and Ular, which depicted a pre-civilized version of the character. We see this version in Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 2. Part 1 of the same ended on a pretty serious note, with He-Man's death and Skeletor gaining the power of Grayskull to become a god, which is also the most sadistic version of this character. With Part 2, we see a brutal transformation of He-Man that changed the lore of MOTU significantly. Not just because of the transformation to the version we're talking about, but because of the fact that Prince Adam did not even require the Sword of Power for that transformation. When Skeletor tries to defeat the heroes in his god persona, Adam laughs and says that he pities the villain for being so dependent on the sword, and also jokes that Skeletor underestimates him big time, indicating that the sword is not really necessary for He-Man to come back to life. Adam muses over what would happen if he called upon the power of Grayskull without actually having the Power Sword in his possession, and this triggers his transformation into Savage He-Man. He turns into a massive caveman driven by nothing except rage and instinct. Even Skeletor deems this as power incarnate, because in this form, He-Man is able to withstand most of the attacks from Skelegod, which he otherwise would not have been able to deflect. You could think of Savage He-Man as embodying the anger of the Hulk and the berserker outlook of Wolverine, with a physique that would put Tarzan to shame. He channels his energy, anger, power, and speed, which is the equivalent of 10 He-Men, and gives Skeletor the thrashing of his life. It's almost funny how the villain basically begs for mercy because he knows he's dead meat, and he also gets jealous of experiencing the sheer power of his sworn enemy and wanting it for himself. Finally, when he's taken care of, Teela explains how this form is the result of all that unbridled power being unleashed without the tempering effect of the sword, making it all rage, all fury with no reason. I appreciated how the show did not tone down just how dangerous this power can be, and portrayed how He-Man always possessed this ability to turn into a mindless agent of chaos, which can harm him as well as his loved ones. In fact, he even tries to harm Teela when she tries to calm him down in the Mystic Mountains, because he simply possesses no intellect to control this form. He almost tears apart the forces at Point Dread and goes about to try and kill King Randor himself in his frenzied state. Fortunately, he still remains Adam deep down, who has goodness at his core. When he hears his father apologize for being a bad parent, it triggers his humane qualities, which ultimately manage to rival the power of Grayskull itself. It calms He-Man enough for him to become Prince Adam again. The experience frightens him so much that he also refuses to call upon that power ever in the future, at least on his own. This would have been a great turning point if Savage He-Man had not been hinted at by the toy line earlier, as I mentioned. This version has no real backstory in the comics or anywhere else, so had it not been for that toy, Revelation would have truly caught fans off guard and become even more thrilling. Still, I cannot disregard the fact that it enriches the lore and also stresses Adam's humanity as the trumpeting force over one of the most dangerous versions of his alter ego. Anti-Eternia He-Man. Welcome to the Multiverse, where imagination is truly boundless. Anti-Eternia He-Man is the reason why I said that Savage He-Man is just one of the most dangerous alternate versions of this beloved character. To understand this one, I need you to think of everything you know about Eternia and He-Man and reverse all of that. You'll end up with a dark mirror world called Anti-Eternia, basically the upside down version of Eternia. And instead of Vecna, you have this evil version of He-Man, who's not the strongest man in the universe, but the most evil man instead. The character first appeared in a German audio play in the year 1985, and then became a recurring variant across the Classics and Masterverse toy lines. Anti-Eternia He-Man was summoned by Skeletor using his world converter when he opened an interdimensional gate between two realities. Anti-Eternia was located in the universe of darkness. This version of He-Man had black skin and red hair. He was a champion of evil, undefeated in combat, and he would raise his sword to call upon the power of Hell Grayskull. He was known as Lord Mata of Hellskull. Despite being the most ruthless tyrant that Anti-Eternia had ever known, Anti-He-Man was defeated by his arch-rival, the heroic Prince Keldor. See how this dimension was truly upside down? For Skeletor to be considered the good guy here? Anyway, this made the baddest He-Man escape through one of the dimensional gates, and he found himself on Eternia. Fortunately for him, his evil powers were unstoppable in this new place, and he was able to conquer almost all of the planet by himself. Skeletor had assumed that this guy would join forces with him to defeat the real He-Man, but he'd underestimated just how powerful Anti-He-Man would be. He was thus thrown out of Snake Mountain and had to form a temporary alliance with the real He-Man himself to fight Anti-He-Man. However, a snake is still a snake, so he ultimately betrayed He-Man by transporting him as well as his evil version to the Antiverse. Skeletor obviously did not count on Adam striking up a friendship with Prince Keldor and overthrowing Anti-He-Man for good in Castle Hellskull. Gwildor and Zodak from Eternia had to use the Cosmic Key to get their hero back to his own world. In MOTU Classics bios, Anti-He-Man returned to Eternia for a second time when Adam was king and challenged him to a fight. However, during this time, Faker got reactivated and attacked both of them. This started a three-way struggle, and Anti-He-Man finally dragged Faker with him to Anti-Eternia, where he made the impersonator serve him despite his distaste. The idea was to pose Faker as the real He-Man and send him in as a spy to Prince Keldor's, known as Anti-Keldor, group of rebels. Anti-Keldor was so appreciative of who he thought was He-Man that he gave the latter enhanced battle armor as a sign of brotherhood. Here's where things start getting weird, because Faker was programmed to obey Skeletor at all costs, and he considered He-Man his absolute enemy. His brain was ultimately made of a computer, so he was unable to process the alternative reality where who he thought was He-Man was actually the bad guy. He eventually began to consider Anti-Keldor as Skeletor himself and shifted his loyalties. He saved Anti-Keldor from sneak attacks by Anti-Man-at-Arms and Anti-Orko. Faker later received a trans-dimensional signal from Eternia and was helped by the heroic scientist Anti-Beastman to return to his dimension. He reunited with Skeletor as soon as he got back to Eternia, but he kept the battle armor that was given to him. When Anti-Keldor was told that Faker was just an android replica and not the real He-Man, even he was extremely taken aback. Anti-He-Man, Masters of the Universe Comics. This version of He-Man appears in the DC Comics miniseries, where many different continuities of the Masters of the Universe franchise come together for the first time in an epic multiverse struggle. Here as well, the concept of Anti-Eternia was posed as the primary threat to every other version of Eternia that existed across the multiverse. This was also the last Masters of the Universe comic to be produced by DC, as the next one, which was a prequel to Revelation, was done by Dark Horse Comics. This version of He-Man was from Anti-Eternia, and he embarked on a mission to slay his counterparts across every dimension and claim their power swords for himself. In the end, only he would remain as the most powerful as well as the evilest person, with no one to challenge him. In order to foil this mission and prevent all the Eternians across the multiverse from becoming toast, an alliance of He-Men from these dimensions recruited the most surprising ally to their cause. You probably guessed it right. This was none other than Prince Keldor, who's the good guy in Anti-Eternia and the direct opposition of Anti-He-Man. This version of Skeletor turned out to be a hero in the same dimension where He-Man turned out to be the villainous villain who ever villained. One of the most interesting parts of this series was seeing the various forms of He-Man that the franchise has expanded into over the years, including a recent mobile game incarnation as well. But what was also fascinating was to see every single version of Skeletor and have them stand against Prince Keldor. Still, if you ask me what my absolute favorite part of this series was, I would probably give the artwork a solid 10 out of 10. Don't get me wrong, the storyline's good too, and the ending is honestly a very enjoyable tribute to what I think is the true power of Grayskull. But the art was out of this world. Literally, if you catch my drift. The unique aesthetic style for each He-Man and each version of Skeletor, right from the gritty live-action version to the chibi mobile app versions, shows how the art reproduced the aesthetics of every era so well without trying to outdo the originals. The only complaint that I have is that this was released alongside another multiversal event at DC, which certainly pushed this to the background a bit. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe still hits all the right chords and pays tribute to the rich and varied history of the MOTU franchise. If you're a newer fan, I definitely recommend this 6-issue miniseries to get a taste of classic He-Man in a DC multiverse style format with the best of both worlds. The more I explore these darker, twisted versions of He-Man, the more I appreciate just how legendary the MOTU franchise really is. The character is mostly an all-around good guy, and he very rarely has to actually work to defeat his foes. I'm not saying that He-Man is boring, but everything about him just became too predictable after a point, especially with Filmation. We all know that he's going to win in the end, so adding a few twists in the middle doesn't really take away from the fact that he's the most powerful man in the universe. If anything, it just makes it more enjoyable and gives He-Man a heroic personality beyond just crossing paths with Skeletor. And that's exactly why I like Revelation so much, even though many fans say it goes off the original concept of the lore behind the Masters of the Universe. No matter how beloved the character is, some growth is necessary to build that appeal for newer fans. Pitting He-Man against an evil version of himself, and then bringing an unlikely hero in the form of Prince Keldor or Anti-Keldor, is really one of the points where the franchise reached a high. Do you agree? If you're enjoying the video, hit like, subscribe for more, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one.